Well, it's time now for our children's message, and you can look around. You're all children today, of course. Grateful for your presence. Now, I was thinking about today's worship service and this story that's going to be the centerpiece of our conversation together today. And I was reminded that when I was a little person, some of my first memories about church were sitting in that basement Sunday school room. And the story that captivated me as a young person was this one, the story of David and Goliath, right? How many of you remember learning that story from the earliest days? One of those first stories, very common. Yeah, absolutely. Now, so because you remember that story and you all know it so well, I got some questions for you, right? We'll see how you do. Now, David was a little boy at the time of this story, right? And but he had a job. David had a job. Do you remember what David's job was? Shepherd. He was a shepherd, yeah, which meant he looked over his family's flock of sheep. Now, David had a bunch of brothers, too, and they were all older. David was the youngest, right? Yeah. And but his older brothers were a part of what? Do you know?
The army.
They were in the army. That's right. All of his older brothers were serving the nation of Israel in the army. And the army was led by a king. Saul. You knew what my question was going to be. Very good. Anticipated. Yeah, Saul. And so kings, now we think of lots of kings, and a king, and then a king has a son, and that son becomes the king one day, and then that king has a son, and that son becomes a king one day. But Saul's dad wasn't a king. Saul was the very first king, right, of Israel. The people of Israel had been sort of led by a series of people after Moses. They'd been led by a series of people that were called judges. And those judges, they weren't very good at what they did for the most part. Some were good, some were really lousy, right? And so the people said, we should have a king like all the other countries. And so God heard them, God heard their pleas and said, okay, and God kind of relented and gave them a king. And with the prophet Samuel's help, they found Saul, and Saul was the first king. Now, so Saul's job primarily was to lead that army, right? And to help keep God's people safe in Israel and where they were living, and to protect their area, right? And they do that with an army. Now, what makes for a good army? Any thoughts? Training, yeah, you got to train your people. You got to drill them and have them practice, right? Yeah, absolutely. Spend a lot of time with that. What else makes for a good army? The equipment, absolutely. What kind of equipment do you think that army had back then? They had things that, what do you call the stuff that you wear? Armor, right? They had armor, and they had, what they carry in their hands? Swords and spears, and what they have on their arms like this? Shields. That's right. That's what an army looked like back then. And the stronger your army was, the better trained they were, the more equipment they had the bigger swords and heavier armor. That provided for a better armies. And these armies back then, how they used to fight, you'd have one army on one side of a valley, and your army would be on the other side of the valley. And you know how they fought? They just came together like that and fought, right? One army, another army, and they just run into each other. Well, they'd fight, right? Once they got close. And so the army that had the better equipment, maybe was better trained, and maybe was just plain bigger and more of, was usually the army that would prevail in those times, right? So, now, our story today, we're talking about King Saul and his army, which included David's older brothers, right? and the Philistine army. And they're staring at each other across a valley. They're on both sides, right? And what would you expect to have happen? How is this battle going to go? These two armies are going to rush in and clash against each other. Now, we don't know much about how big the Philistine army was. We don't know how well equipped they were. But we know something really important about that army. They had one really impressive person in that army. And his name was Goliath. And Goliath wasn't just an average-sized soldier. He was a giant. He was big. Now, think of the biggest person you've ever seen. He was probably even bigger than that, right? He was a big, big man. And not only that, he was so big and confident in his own abilities that he loved to taunt. You know what it is to taunt? To taunt is to sort of, what would you say if you were going to taunt someone? Hey there, shorty. Come on over here and, tease them. Exactly, that's right, yeah. Goliath was a teaser. What? And he trash talked all the time, exactly. And so Goliath was out there taunting the Israelite army and King Saul. And his primary taunt was, your God can't protect you. Your God can't save you this day because we're gonna crush you, right? Goliath was not a nice man. And so David, who was what? He was not in the army. He was a shepherd boy, but he was there visiting his brothers and checking on what King Saul was doing, right? And keeping tabs. And he was actually part of King Saul's sort of support system at the time. And David was, convinced that God was on their side. And so he summoned all his courage and he volunteered to go and fight Goliath, because Goliath had issued a challenge. He said, if you can send out any one person in that Israelite army over here to fight me and can best me, then you can win the day, and you can win all the spoils. The Philistines will all become your slaves. But if I win Goliath, then all you Israelites will become our slaves. Well, David heard that challenge, and he thought, this is a great way for God to prevail in this time. That we, God's army of the Israelites, could beat the whole Philistine army by only having to beat one person. Not this whole huge army that would have to come clash together, but just one person and one boy. Now, a good warrior needed equipment and training, right? And David wasn't trained, and David, he was a shepherd, right? And he didn't have any equipment. And King Saul, who said, well, okay, if this is what we're going to do, King Saul tried to put on his armor onto the little shepherd boy. What do you think happened when the king's armor got put on to the little boy? He couldn't even move. He couldn't even walk, right? And so, and then he got handed the king's sword. Can you imagine David dragging this sword that he probably couldn't even lift? How was he going to fight Goliath like that? But David was smart. He said, I'm going to use what I know. Because I know that God has given me gifts, and God has raised me and given me a purpose. I'm a shepherd. What do I do? What do I do? I protect sheep. And what did he use to protect sheep? A slingshot, right? Yeah, a sling. And what did he use in his sling? Rocks, right? So David bent down and he picked up, says, 5 smooth stones, good stones for throwing in his sling. And his sling was not like one of these, but it was on a long string, and it had a little basket at the end, and you'd swing it around like this, and then you let it go flying. And he was so good at picking off the predators of his sheep that he could hit a target a long ways away. So that's what David did, right? He used his sling to hit Goliath right in the forehead. And Goliath never expected it, and down he goes. The biggest problem in the whole world at the time for the Israelites was Goliath. And little David, the shepherd boy, took him out, using what he had and the gifts that God had given him, and the smarts and the knowledge and the wisdom and the courage to face down that big giant problem. And that's the story that we're going to think about today. And so all of you, as you're sitting there thinking about, well, I'm not a giant. I don't have the right equipment. I don't have the right training to face down big problems. Think about that a little differently. Think about how God has gifted you and what God has given to you in your life that might just be what's needed to help face down big problems.